Live and Leave Well. Reflections of a Lifelong Nurse. Written by Christian Mauri. In conversation with Peter Rebbechi. Author's Welcome. By Christian Mauri. In early 2023, Peter Rebbechi began searching for an author to help share reflections from her long career as a nurse. She was directed to me by our mutual friend, Kyle Spyrides, who was an early supporter of my life story service, Family Tales, and to whom Peter and myself are deeply grateful. When Peter canvassed her idea for a book to encourage young nurses in their art, I told her my work tends between serious sociology and playful stories. With a reassuring smile that soothed so many, she told me not to worry. Her heart said that this was the right path. And so the old nurse and the young sociologist got to work. This book is the fruit of our collaboration. Welcome. It is an unusual little book, no doubt about it, but it is written with sincerity for all of us, nurse, student, or any other considerate mortal. May it be of service to you and whomever is blessed enough to receive your care. To that end, let's begin with context and outline what to expect. Born in West Australia in 1947, Barbara Mary Peter Rebbechi is one of Australia's oldest working nurses. Initially going by Peter, she took the name Peter with an A after being excluded from a tennis tournament when the organisers presumptuously registered her as a boy. The second of 4 siblings, Peter was especially close to her older brother of 18 months, Joseph. At age 13, Joseph suffered severe burns when a copper fire, kerosene, and cotton pajamas met a sudden change in the wind. Peter came home from school to the news that Joseph had been airlifted to Darwin Hospital. The tragedy was met with silence, leaving Peter in quiet despair. A few nights after the incident, Peter woke to a voice that told her, "I'm going to take Joe home." Waking her father with the news, he promised they'd catch the next plane to Darwin. When they arrived, Joseph was covered in bandages and unable to speak. Peter sat with her brother for a long time, whispering that she loved him and gazing into his eyes to make sure that he understood. Joseph died a few days later. Nobody talked about it. Children were not permitted at the funeral. In one mad week, Peter was introduced to death, silence, tenderness, and religious experience. It shaped what was to come. I doubt this book would exist had the wind not changed that day. Peter committed her life to the caring vocation. Completing her nursing training in Fremantle in 1965, Peter took on a series of stations in the regional communities of Australia's First Nations. The contrasting cultural approaches to health and care in these communities made a critical thinker of the young nurse, such that she became confident to question narrow-minded authority. Her career in the nearly 60 years that followed would be terrifically diverse. She welcomed people into the world as a midwife. She headed the clinic on Rottnest Island and served as the in-home nurse for a fabulously rich and profoundly lonely woman in her mansion on the Channel Islands. She assisted in the establishment of Perth's first palliative care facility, provided in-home care across the suburbs, and oversaw teams of staff and students as the director of nursing in a major hospital. Buffeted by challenges, she maintained course by the threefold winds of belief in her vocation, faith in her God, and support from her husband. Without some comparable winds at our back, at least in Peter's estimation, we are all in danger of becoming becalmed or driven on by the uncaring motor of industry. Imagine the perspective granted by such an extensive career. All of the continuities and changes watched, fought for, and resisted. Peter saw firsthand as nursing transformed from a person-centered art into a rational profession with narrow specializations. She saw taken for granted holistic approaches and intuition give way to the fascination with technology, efficiency, and business. She watched yesterday's decisions grow into what are now accepted as regrettably unavoidable facts of the matter, both by the young folk who don't know any better and older folk who should. All of this has equipped Peter to not only imagine alternatives to our current system, but to proactively recall them. In sponsoring a book to share these recollections, she hopes that the future might be a more caring place than what today's trends would have us expect. But Peter is old. She feels it and accepts it. She is also aware of how much times have changed. People read and listen differently now. They have different priorities. Old assumptions are no longer obvious. Ideas once considered settled now seem novel, nostalgic, and increasingly unimaginable. For all of this, she is happy to be the guide and interviewee, and trusts someone half her age to write the book in her own words. This brings us to the question of process. Peter did the living and the sharing. I did the steeping and the writing. Peter and I shared a great many lunches and walks together from June 2023 to April 2024. Falling back into old habits, I often tried to draw the focus away from ideas and back into Peter's living room. I'd ask about photos and for biographical information about who, where, and when. Peter always gave the same response. You can read about that in my book. You see, Peter's extensive autobiography, titled A Girl Called Peter, was published in 2021. While it informs much of what follows, Peter made it clear that the world did not need another book about her life. The point of our time together was not to retrace her steps, but to recall and consider what might be of use to others. It was not to get her to put everything in her own words, but to see what we might come up with through heartfelt conversation with one another. The point, in short, is a service. It is to share the why. We began with nursing students in mind, intent on a university text to be digested while catching the train to campus or practicum. We then recognized a wider readership, as our conversations increasingly gravitated around death and dying. So then, what is this book about and who is it for? It is about the relationship between caring and healing, as expressed by an old woman who has dedicated her life to the art of nursing in a changing world. In descending order, it is written for current and would-be nurses, then for those who would give and receive care, and most broadly for a society that could benefit from more time spent relating to death and dying. If the reviewers are anything to go by, some of the stories to come will be unexpectedly helpful. Some parts risk an academic tone, and others will make you cry. That's okay. Every bit is worth your time. Before concluding, there are two important points of context. First is that Peter is a devout Christian. Her faith and relationship to God informs her in thought and action. She finds the world a meaningful and sacred place. In her view, we have souls from which we gain a dignity and light that has priority over all the categories of personhood employed in daily life, be it as a patient, professional, spouse, student, or customer. It is for each person to decide how they will return to their Creator, and it is wrong to prolong life at the cost of autonomy, dignity, and the meaning we can give to life by coming to terms with our mortality. It would be sad for a potential reader to turn away from this book due to Peter's faith. Yet I have already observed such reactions several times, with younger commentators warning that people will be put off by the sense that an illustration is too churchy or a concept too Christian. While such responses bode poorly for possibilities of rich understandings ranging from the historical, the sociological, the spiritual, the psychological, to the intergenerational, multicultural, and interpersonal, it is nevertheless helpful feedback. Let me therefore be clear from the outset. While Peter is unapologetically a woman of faith, her perspective resembles the secular humanism widely endorsed by English-speaking readers regardless of their views on religion. So far that her faith informs what remains, she believes in the afterlife and its consolations, the vocational sense of pursuing a passion, and the view that wholeness is essential to healing. Second is that, due to this book being a collaboration between two very different individuals, you should expect it to be unusually dynamic in terms of style and tone. My initial intention was to use the transcripts from our interviews as the foundation for the work. However, this swiftly gave the ugly sense of ghostwriting. The feeling of inauthenticity that accompanied this approach resulted in cruel periods of writer's block. Watching me struggle, Peter intervened. She reminded me that a book written in her words already exists, and that everything will be easier if we choose to simply be ourselves. After all, she said with that same reassuring smile, you're not a nurse. Write however you feel comfortable, the result will be as it should. It was an express permission to write as a sociologist, while using Peter's stories to give lightness and blood to the heavy and dry. The result is a book with two souls, no illusions, and the occasional chance of whiplash. Peter is more often described than quoted directly, while the stories written from her perspective are the concentrated product of longer conversations that we return to many times. For all of this and more, I am sincerely grateful to Peter. It is no small thing for one to share with you their hopes and their dreams and say, make of this what you will. I extend Peter's gracious invitation to you. Make what you will of what is to come. May it help you live and leave well. The Art of Nursing. Quote, my heart goes out to the young nurses. The way our world is going, they must not lose faith in the power of connection for human beings. Now, more than ever, we must strive to uphold the art. End quote. Peter Rebbechi. Nursing as a vocation. Let me share Peter's reflections from her life as a nurse. Some of these are inspiring, others are terrible. Those that pass the membrane into this chapter serve Peter's threefold hope. First, she hopes to encourage nurses to recognize the good of their work by championing the art of nursing. Second, she hopes to show what has changed and what is at stake. She warns against what she calls the dark forces that nurses increasingly face in much of their work. The dark forces of workplace bullying by frustrated and fatigued colleagues. The business think that mutilates institutions at an industrial scale, and the mechanistic thinking that treats human needs as surplus to purpose. For this, we share her story of discovering traditional nursing in the 1960s and then rediscovering holistic nursing in the new millennium. Third, she invites us all to embrace holistic thinking more broadly, in the hope that we can better nurse our human needs. To this end, she has provided an exercise that combines healing touch with the Lord's Prayer. Whatever your beliefs, please try it and see for yourself how it feels. We begin by reflecting on what emerged from our discussion as the threefold elements of nursing as a vocation. For, to Peter, the art and the vocation are inseparable. Before vocation referred to mundane training or the job one does for money, it was the voice that calls one to work. This is where we get the saying, find your calling. Called by what? For Peter and the saints for whom so many hospitals and services are named, the answer is God. In this time of secular disenchantment, the closest most of us come to this belief is the idea that we each have hidden within us a passion. In Australia, as in the United Kingdom and the United States, you are instructed from early in life to find your passion. This expression hints at something essential about a person that compels them to care more about one pursuit than all of the others. Like vocation, passion is broadly linked to the aspiration to find our role in the world. We say, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. While the old Christian idea of a passion esteems suffering as evidence of the sacrifice one willingly endures for love, the new idea of pursuing one's passion esteems sacrifice as evidence of sincerity in work and authenticity in self. In the Christian world, this is called good work. as in work that aligns external activities with moral beliefs and teachings. The idea is that this enables instrumental actions as a means to an end to feel substantively meaningful as an end in themselves. In contemporary Australia, we call this being value-driven. Whatever we call it, this idea of acting out in a value rather than reacting to external pressure is cherished in our society. We care about it in a profoundly moral way. It is an ethic and ideology that pervades our lifetime as an unfolding promise. It is taught in schools, advertised in media, preached by paragons and projected onto rebels. It is called for by job advertisements and echoed in job applications. It is touted on the value statements of large organizations, from hospitals and universities, all the way down to small family businesses selling air conditioning units. Even with all of its challenges and exploitations, it is a powerful tool for transmuting the mere into the meaningful. It stokes the vital conviction that even the most alienated among us are not yet entirely disenchanted. It is a hopeful idea. This is not to say that such an aspiration is achievable by all people. In telling children they have a passion waiting to be discovered and deployed for income, countless people have grown up to be listless. They internalize an externally imposed inadequacy as they wait for that special something deep within to come unstuck and rise to the surface. A popular response to this is strategic self-presentation, or what we might call brand management, or pro-felicity, whereby people become adept at presenting themselves as if they are value-driven to better attract social and professional rewards. While actually caring is not a necessary condition for such strategies, such messaging inflates the demand for an authentic passion among the young and impressionable. For the older and more cynical, it undermines it. For all of this, it is reasonable to be skeptical of the idea of a genuine vocation. Yet one can always find those who choose their path according to some convincing heartfelt directive. They do so despite it being economically irrational, with better pay and more security offered elsewhere. It can be instrumentally irrational, with the walker being the first to admit that their effort is unlikely to make a major difference in the scheme of things. The way can be physically grueling, emotionally distressing, psychologically exhausting, and spiritually draining. But they walk it gladly. This positive existential relationship to work is rare. In contrast, there is no shortage of inhumane work that the unfortunate are forced into. There is plenty of what we can call bad work, for which one feels they are contradicting their values and hurting the world. There is an abundance of so-called bullshit jobs, which cynically generate pointless work to extract an income. Most common of all is the simple exchange relationship to work as just a job. To substantively care about work is rather rare. Indeed, when there is rent and debt to worry about, it looks like a privilege. This brings us to the vocational question. Would you still do the work if you were not compelled by material and social pressures? Would you sacrifice for it? Why? Here we can make a distinction between the complementary and the contradictory. For example, think of a teacher who longs to help their students develop into good adults, but instead find that most of their time is spent not on teaching, but on behavior management and administrative duties. The teacher can then ask, do these conditions complement or contradict what I had in mind when I set out on this path? We celebrate, that is, we compliment, people who demonstrate alignment between their values and their work. We celebrate organizations that enable, rather than inhibit, such alignments as good places to work. We see contradiction as a valid response for a person to fight for change, quit, or quietly refuse to give any extra care to an organization that won't care back. Keep this in mind, for it has much to do with the attrition of young nurses and the activism or jadedness of older ones. When the complementary and the contradictory become irrelevant questions, then we can say that the work has been emptied of substantive value, leaving only the transactional relationship expressed as, it's just a job. Now, suppose you are a patient. What traits and conditions do you think would complement your nurse? What temperament and values would you like to be held by the nurse of a loved one? What would prompt you to see in another person the qualities of a nurse? Conversely, what temperament, values, and working conditions make for a poor nurse? What would contradict the ideals and duties of nursing, even if it might complement a different role elsewhere? Would the qualities that make for an effective lawyer or administrator suit a role so people-facing and emotionally demanding as a nurse? I ask you, what type of character is suited to nursing? For Peter, the answer is clear. One with the will and the ability to care for humans in need. To help express this, Peter kept bringing the discussion back to what she considers to be the essential elements in the art of nursing. The art of nursing has 3 essential elements: care, holism, and respect. Care. Care is Peter's first essential element in the art of nursing. The nurse must care for both the state of the patient and the state of the art. To do this properly, they must view the patient above all as a human being with human needs. While this sounds obvious, the system exerts terrible pressure to abandon the art. The limited supply of resources and labor, coupled with data-driven processes, often lead to patients being treated as numbers to be churned in and out of the system with minimal fuss. Then there is the market rationality that prioritizes people not according to their needs, but to their means as customers. Alongside these bureaucratic and business models is the biomedical model, which reduces the person to material parts and presenting issues. Before long, care for the human disappears, so that it is not the patient that is checked on by the nurse, but the charts and the machinery surrounding them. The greater the pressure from the system, be it in terms of funding or policies, the less realistic and more privileged humane care appears. We see this in the older, people-centered term, duty to care, being replaced today with the impersonal, risk-averse duty of care. Thus, care must stand on 2 legs if it is not to topple. First, it must stand for considerate care for the patient as a human being. Second, it must stand for the care for the integrity of the art. What does this look like? As we will see in the stories to come, it involves the holistic recognition of people as thinking, feeling beings. Beings that can feel not only sick, but frightened, uncertain, and lonely. Beings that can be held and comforted. The contemporary medical practitioner may view the patient through the lens of the presenting issue, which in turn is to view them as comprised of organs, systems, diseases, and testables. The nurse, in contrast, is the humane support and agent between the institution and the patient. Peter describes this by remembering when it was perfectly acceptable for a nurse to hold the hand and rub the shoulder of a frightened patient when they arrived. To spend substantive time with a human beyond making beds, checking charts, dating schedules, and tending to the fluids. And so again, for here Peter would often repeat, to care for the well-being of others is to tend to the human need for humane care. As this is easily discouraged, complementary values are vital. Thus care goes hand in hand with 2 more essential elements in the art of nursing, holism and respect. Holism. Peter often described holism in contrast to the biomedical model. There is utility to the latter, for in narrowing consideration down to the body and its intake, actionable pathways for intervention appear. The issue is when this model closes other avenues and minds to further considerations that may help heal the human. Peter describes this as the tendency to cure without caring and to see problems, not people. The alternative is to see the patient as a whole human living in context, This too seems obvious. We know what stress and despair do to health and how these relate to work, connectedness, and meaning. We know improvements in these can benefit not just individuals but their families, friends, and community, which in turn can take pressure off the health system. We also know that touch and tenderness are human needs that help with trust and healing, most of all with the vulnerable. These human needs are easily forgotten as doctors and nurses scan their charts and their screens for medical and administrative relevancies. Thus, while holism is often described as the idea of the whole being greater than its parts, we can take it here to mean that there is more to human wellness than is reducible to a single model. One must also accommodate the need for meaning, connection, creativity, and dignity, even if these involve practices that are unsupported by robust research. Holistic care, in other words, requires intuition. Holistic care is open-ended. Along with the organic, it encourages us to consider the social, emotional, and spiritual needs of the person in the context of their history and environment. Because of this, it is first and foremost a relational perspective. Just as each organ cannot be properly understood in isolation from the whole body, the whole person comes into focus when seen in relation to their relationships. Their relationship to their surroundings, to food, to health and fitness, to traditions, institutions and authority, to medication, to addiction, their relationship to circles of support and cycles of abuse, their relationship to work, housing, security, money, insurance and stress, their relationship to life and suffering, death and dying, and fear. All these factors play a part in human health. They inform how we treat ourselves and influence how we seek and respond to help from others. They expand considerations of the human beyond the flesh. Thus, to think holistically is to think expansively. Here I recognize a keen sociological imagination in Peter's descriptions. For the personal trouble of disease can be situated alongside the structural issues in how people are treated, not just medically, but by institutions, by families and hospitals and insurance companies and governments. It is a lot to account for. Attempting to account for everything is the opposite of useful. As an Australian medical student told me, doctors tend to agree with holism in principle, they just lack the time and resources in practice. This is undoubtedly so in a great many cases, though it is also the case that, due to either their training or their timing, many within the system fail to even consider thinking holistically. They are concerned with biomedical solutions and organizational procedures. The broader social, psychological, and spiritual factors implicated in health are beyond their purview. Peter insists that this need not be so, least of all for nurses. Indeed, nurses once took for granted many practices that are now classed today as holistic. To better appreciate the limits of this formulation, let's briefly explore some distinctions. First, disease and illness. Suppose that disease refers to an identifiable material pathology brought about by aging, infection, traumatic injury, carcinogens, and so on. From this perspective, disease is a biomedical description of something going wrong with the body. Illness describes the complications and complaints ostensibly experienced due to something going wrong, such as discomfort or pain, lethargy, disorientation, or impairment. Physical wellness is a sign of good health. Illness is the opposite. Disease and illness are disorders because they represent deviations from the normal, orderly functioning of the body in the case of disease and of the person in the case of illness. One can be unaware of having a disease until illness occurs to signal something is off. Signals can be clear, such as with pain at a specific part of the body, but they can also be unclear, such as an assortment of complaints with seemingly little connection to external events or to one another. It could be a general malaise that persists for so long that it no longer seems like a signal at all. Or it can be misleading, as with psychosomatic illness. In short, cause need not correspond to comfort. One can care for the illness without curing the disease, just as one can insist on potential cures that worsen illness. As a nurse, Peter spent her life doing the former, while watching too many in the system doing the latter. The chemotherapist bombarding a single organ in a body riddled with cancer. Surgeons insisting on this back surgery or that pelvic mesh. The hasty masking of disorders behind medications, the list is endless. In sociology, we take this further by thinking about the relationship between unwell person and society. We describe the so-called sick role, whereby the sick person is permitted and even encouraged to have time out from the usual activities of modern life, such as going to work or school, attending events, and meeting household responsibilities. This time out comes with conditions, however. The sick person is expected to indicate relevant signs of their illness by sniffing, wincing in pain, and looking exhausted. They are expected to demonstrate the desire to get better by seeing a medical professional and faithfully following their advice to rest. Here we see the unfurling before us of a messy horizon of psychosocial factors that take us well beyond the medical model. There are countless compelling reasons for a person to ignore the disorder or reject the sick role. They may be unwilling to acknowledge that something is wrong for what it reveals about their lifestyle. They may not have the time or money to visit the doctor or stop working. Their own experiences or reports from community may have instilled an aversion to hospitals and a distrust of professionals. Alternatively, in the desire to solve the disorder as a single issue, they may accept the first diagnosis, take the medications and pay the bills, but fail to consider alternative explanations concerning lifestyle or environment, thus going on to experience a costly and debilitating recurring illness. This is all to say that the art of nursing requires initiative and curiosity. Peter describes this as knowing the normal so that you can spot the abnormal. While focusing on the patient as only a biomedical subject narrows this mode of knowing down to illness and disease, holistic thinking opens us up to the broader field of relational factors. This does not require us to take everything beneath the sun into account. Instead, it means that nurses should maintain and defend a principled commitment to open-mindedness and intuition. The physician is trained to think in terms of biomedical science. The hospital must account for business and policy. It is the privilege and duty of the nurse to keep the art of healing alive within the health system. Do not wait for instruction from the system to care for your fellow humans. Holding hands is timeless work. Respect. This element took the longest for me to understand. What could Peter mean by respect? Nursing, like many essential roles in our society, is relatively low pay and high stress. This has long been counterbalanced by strong social trust. When a person sets out to become a nurse or reveals they already are one, they can reliably assume the consensus that they have a real job that matters. This enables them to identify as a recognizable type of person with a level of legitimacy and necessity in the workforce that is above questioning. So too does it bring to mind qualities. Just as a university professor is assumed to be clever, a city solicitor serious, and a firefighter brave, a nurse is assumed to be patient and caring. In a word, nursing is widely seen as good. We can call this respect for nurses by society societal respect. This is surely a factor in the attractiveness of nursing. Moreover, it translates in some measure to the respect for the nurse by the patient. It helps to make their job easier. For contrast, consider other care and social work roles where respect is not so naturally assumed within society. Societal respect, however, is not what Peter has in mind for this element. A second interpretation is that Peter means respect for the patient by the nurse. We can call this patient respect. While this is absolutely vital to nursing, it is already broadly covered by the other two elements. After all, if a nurse cares for a patient as a whole person, rather than as a body attached to a presenting issue, they will treat them respectfully. If they instead treat them as units to be processed as quickly as possible, then they have failed at holistic care. Such failure can be performed politely, which any clerk or government officer could deem respectful enough, while falling woefully short of the art. A nurse is most in danger of this when experiencing the well-documented symptoms of empathy fatigue. At the risk of oversimplifying the matter, emotional proximity to people in distress wears one down over time. Like a hand becomes leathery to protect itself from hard labor, nurses can gradually harden against their vicarious identification with the feelings of others. Left unchecked, the nurse can develop compassion fatigue, thereby losing the desire to care for their patients. With this, prior stated characteristics that make one suited to nursing, the ability and the will to care for humans in need, are threatened by overwork and undersupport. In other words, patient respect is tightly linked to structural and cultural conditions of work. We are getting closer to what Peter has in mind. Then there is what we can call collegial respect. This is respect for nurses by the people for whom they work. Here we see a history of disrespect. Nursing has historically been seen as women's work. Nurses have long faced sexism, condescension, and predation from their historically male medical colleagues. There is also truth to the saying that nurses eat their young. Here, senior nurses, due to their experience or differences in manner or training, presume superiority over their fresher colleagues. This expresses itself in condescension, excessive criticism, gossiping, unfair work allocation, ganging up, and exclusion. From all quarters, nurses have fought to be taken seriously for the work that they do, and sometimes this fight turns inward. We will not dwell on this here. Suffice to say that, while the history of interpersonal and institutional disrespect toward nursing and nurses is still unfolding, the art has managed to survive and sometimes flourish despite these dark forces. Finally, as our months of meeting were nearing an end, Peter plucked her idea fully formed from the air. Respect for nurses means to let them nurse. It is to respect the nursing vocation. In Peter's view, respect is the complementary constellation of conditions that enable nurses to act with integrity. These are the conditions of space, time, resources, trust, and support that underpin social respect, patient respect, and collegial respect. As a sociologist, I interpret this as speaking to the boundary maintenance of a functional distinction. In business speak, they call this leveraging the unique value proposition of nursing, whereby to be a nurse is to be different to a doctor, cleaner, or phlebotomist. To let nurses nurse is to enable them to provide holistic care for people, and thus to complement the substantive values that core them to work. We can call this vocational respect. Thus, an essential element of the art of nursing is to respect it as more than just a job, and strive for integrity. What is at stake? As these elements are eroded, two issues will grow beyond easy reversal. First is what we can call the vocational issue. Feeling fatigued and contradicted in their work, values-driven nurses will burn out and leave. These are the people who identify with the art of nursing and are sensitive to its contemporary contradictions. Without them, the maintenance of the art will wither. Second is what we can call the holistic issue. As the caring intermediary between the human and the institution withers, we will increasingly lose sight of the forest of the person for the tree of the presenting issue. This will be subject to structural and economic pressures, for this century, in which we are ostensibly more advanced and wealthier than ever, is defined by the evaporation of time and resources. It will also be due to changes in how we think of services, and thus in our expectations of what counts as appropriate care. One useful way to think of this is with the replacement of the reasonable, whereby staff can use their own judgment to determine suitable action, with the rational, whereby all possibility is subject to bureaucratic regulation. The holism endorsed by Peter will become increasingly alienated by these processes. Intimacy and initiative will be ever more inappropriate, deemed risky. The art will lose so much ground as to seem foreign, romantic, and regrettably not possible. In the mind of many, it already is. Consider what is at stake with these two issues. What happens when nurses receive ever less time, resources, and encouragement to nurse? How will they contend with these contradictions? Plenty of them will stay, for they need the work and have invested a lot of time to receive accreditations. Some will pursue specialist or management roles, or take up university teaching and clinical research. Some will take to viewing their work as an instrumental source of income, just a job, thereby becoming increasingly numb to the contradictions. The rest will quit. Some of these will be seasoned nurses who will take their institutional memory and wisdom with them. The majority, likely enough to constitute a crisis, will be new nurses into whom much has been invested. Few will be enticed back. For Peter, these issues are the creeping coldness of a future that is uninviting to would-be nurses and their would-be patients. It is experienced already in the frustration of visiting the doctor only to be ignored in favor of a computer monitor, and in the isolation of hospital guests whose understaffed nurses hurry in to check their charts before leaving without a considerate word. It is a tragic problem, for the looming mental health and loneliness pandemics will have a profound impact on public health. The sufferers will need the holistic care that was once the norm. Instead, they will be told to find it for themselves, perhaps at yoga or an expensive private clinic, or by getting involved in community with the help of anti-anxiety tablets. This may sound alarmist for those who have not been in the system long enough to see the trends unfurl. For those overseeing the profession and its policies, it may even seem naive to point out the issue. Who has the time and resources to stand before the juggernaut of such a future? Peter, for her part, has been a nurse for almost 6 decades. She has seen generations of doctors and nurses come and go in the cities and regions. As a director of nursing, she implemented models and consulted governments. She has seen enough to know in her heart that the creeping cold need not be terminal. There is still time. Care can be nursed back to health. A renaissance in nursing beckons.